Good afternoon. My name's Ron Perry, and I work here at the library. On behalf of the Friends of the Library and Susan Chambers, who heads that up, I'd like to welcome you all to today's program. Looking over the audience, many of us grew up during the 60s looking at the panel. I don't even know if these guys were born or not in the 60s when we were growing up. But if you remember, there were lots of students protesting then, and it seemed like a pretty cool thing to do back in those days. And you know, I thought I'd like to do it too, but I was just a little kid, and my parents wouldn't let me leave the street we lived on, so I didn't get to do it then. And then you fast forward 40 years, and we're baby boomers. And so nowadays we have our own kids, and they're big kids, they're grown-ups. And the other, when Occupy Nashville was here, I was telling my son about it. He's grown up, and he listened to me very patiently talking about it. And I was thinking back to the 60s, thinking it was a cool thing to do. And he listened to me patiently, and he said, "Dad, at your age, the only thing you need to be occupying is the bathroom." So much for that. So much for... the truth is, our generation, we weren't very good at changing the world, but we were good at going to concerts. And next Tuesday is the last concert in the Courtyard Concert Series. I'd like to invite you to come. It's Jason D. Williams with rockabilly music, and that's the last one. If you can stick around afterwards, Caroline Kennedy will be up in the Grand Reading Room, and that'll be at 1 o'clock to sign copies of their latest book, Listening In, The Secret White House Courtings of John F. Kennedy. So we'd like to invite you for that. And then next Thursday, on October the 11th, Mark Shriver, this is another blast from the 60s, wrote a book about Sergeant Shriver. It was his father. And Phil Bredesen will be here then with John Siegenthaler, and we hope you can join us for that. And then also next week, beginning on October the 12th, next Friday, is the beginning of the Southern Festival of Books. And if you haven't been to that, I would like to encourage, if you're a book lover, this is great. It doesn't get any better than that. A lot of those programs will be up in the plaza. Some will be here at the in the library. And the hours will change a little bit. We're going to be opening on Sunday at noon. We normally open at 2 o'clock to accommodate these programs. So I'd like to encourage you to come to any of those programs that you can. And now I'm going to let Dr. Woods come and occupy this podium so we can get on with our program. Dr. Woods.
Great, thanks so much, Ron, and also thanks to Susan and Larry and Georgia from the library for making this event possible, and to you for coming. Our convener today is Professor Dana Nelson, who's the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Professor of English and American Studies here at Vanderbilt. She teaches American literature, history, and culture, and courses that connect activism, volunteering, and citizenship. And she's a leading progressive advocate for engaged citizenship and democracy. She's also a fierce critic, and I think it's kind of relevant given the debate tonight in Denver, fierce critic of presidential power and our willingness as a public to accede to that power and to think that the president can be like daddy to us and do everything for us. What she calls a culture of presidentialism. Instead, she's really an advocate for serious grassroots activism, and this comes out very strongly in this sort of critical attitude to giving power to the people at the top in her book from 2008, Bad for Democracy. Now, no one would, I imagine, rather live in some other form of government than a democracy. And yet there have always been critics. It seems to allow for the tyranny of the majority. It's open to all kinds of corruption, and it favors demagogues rather than good leaders. And in the last couple of years, as you know, we've witnessed all kinds of extraordinary things like financial meltdown and the apparent failure of the political and legal system to deal with the culprits, let's say, the big banks. We've had warnings about the military-industrial complex, as if they are running the country rather than us. We have, of course, still have elections, and yet many worry that elections can be bought by men with deep pockets. So perhaps we imagine a return to direct democracy of the sort they had in Rome and Athens, but then we remember the cult of oratory, swaying the public with fine words. We remember that the Greeks were perfectly happy with slavery. So I think it's against this background and a sense that the democratic values of social justice, public integrity, and so on are being lost sight of, that something like Occupy arose, and in Nashville a year ago, pretty much to the day or the week, we had the movement here, and it's sort of metastasized all over the planet. But where is it now? And what does it still promise? And what can we hope for from it? Dana is going to introduce some real grassroots activists, and we should learn something about that from them.
Thank you. I'm talking to the microphone. Can you hear me? No? Better? Okay, so I really have to talk into the microphone. Okay, I'm delighted to be invited to do this. My own involvement with the occupation had to do with my going down to check it out. I am really interested in anything that produces more citizen-based democracy. I'm really interested in watching people produce democratic power for themselves at the ground level. And so when Occupy Wall Street started, I was very interested. And when our own occupation in Nashville began a year ago this weekend, I was down here almost immediately checking it out. I quickly became addicted to attending the General Assemblies as well as to the street marches. But the General Assemblies in particular were places where people really were able to learn how to talk across political differences. And some of that happened through what people considered on the outside the silliest feature of the occupation, which was the human microphone, which is that one person would speak and the whole audience would repeat it. There was something fascinating that happened when you had to project opinions that you disagreed with. It made you really listen to them. So I blogged about the occupation. There were lots of really exciting things happening, and I wanted to talk about our Nashville occupation to a national audience. I would like to point out that in addition to the women on the stage here, there are many people from the occupation in our audience today, and they would like to invite all of you to attend the anniversary celebrations in Legislative Plaza this Sunday. There are a number of events that will be happening. And if you're interested in flyers, this gentleman in the front has them, so please feel free to pick one up to remind yourself to attend. If you didn't go to the occupation while it was in place, this is a neat opportunity to get to meet some of the different people who engaged in the occupation and have really interesting, politically bracing conversations with them. Some of the best political conversations in my life happened in the fall months last year. So let me introduce the women on the stage. These are all super busy women. We're really lucky to have them. They were all actually in the occupation for different durations. And I'm just going to start with my immediate left. Sarah Passano received her PhD in literature from Vanderbilt. After volunteering in poor people's movements, she realized that's where she wanted to spend her time. She believes the line between education and organizing is best when perforated. Her dissertation asked how we tell stories of economic violence. She agrees with some of the best authors. That's really hard to do. She agrees with poor people's movements. This story is best told by people who feel that violence, but by fighting against it, begin to find a vocabulary for naming it together. Our second panelist, DJ Hudson, is currently a student at Vanderbilt Divinity School and a graduate of Fisk University, where she earned her bachelor's degree in history. While at Fisk, she researched the Nashville sit-in movement and organized her campus around issues of racial and economic justice. Upon meeting civil rights veteran James Lawson, she began studying nonviolence with him and other Nashville activists and organizers. During her second year at Vanderbilt, she became an active member of Occupy Nashville, continuing her activism for economic justice and equality. And finally, our final panelist, Lindsay Krinks, was born in Memphis, raised in Spartansburg, South Carolina. She's currently pursuing her Master's of Theological Studies at the Vanderbilt Div School, where she's a Cal Turner Fellow and a Brandon Scholar. She's co-founder of Open Table Nashville and Amos House Community. She was heavily involved with Occupy Nashville and was arrested in the police raids last October. For the last 5 years, she's been active in homeless outreach and housing rights organizing, and she is dedicated to journeying with those who are marginalized both on and off the streets. So what I'm going to do is just start asking some questions of these women and letting them answer, and we'll see how far we get on my list of 9. So let me just start with the opening question. What drew you to the Occupy Wall Street movement in general? Anybody who wants to field that can take it on.
I can go speak a little briefly. I actually first heard about the Occupy Wall Street movement via Twitter from one of my favorite musicians, Lupe Fiasco, who is a rap artist who has increasingly been more vocal about his political beliefs. And I saw it and I didn't understand what it was at first, and so I Googled it. I thought it was a joke. I thought it was a meme. And then I started seeing pictures of people with mattresses and sleeping bags, and it hit me. I was like, these people are protesting, but they're not going home. They're not planning on going home. And for me, that's been something I've dreamed of seeing for a very long time, is to see a protest and see people who are committed to pointing out inequality, pointing out injustice, but who are also committed to not going home after they've had their say. And so that's what got my attention initially.
I'll say briefly that I was so excited to see people in New York and on the Brooklyn Bridge when 700 people were arrested and kettled and caught in orange nets and pepper sprayed because it meant that people were awake for years before anything happened with the movement, Occupy movement. I had been so frustrated and I felt so small and powerless when I thought about the corporations, the multinational corporations, the transnational corporations, the groups like Monsanto and others who are literally privatizing and capitalizing and financializing our world. And then a few years ago, my father is a physician in South Carolina, and his hospital was taken over by HCA. And I know HCA is in Nashville, but it completely changed the way he practiced medicine. It wasn't about his patients anymore after it was corporatized. It was about the shareholders and the stakeholders. And my dad is a white middle-class working person, and he felt something. After 2008, white middle-class people started feeling what a lot of other people have felt for a long time. And I was just, we're so small, we're all so small, and to see a movement talking about this, I felt empowered, and I had to go. I had to go because it was in my bones. Like I just needed to be there, so I was. And it was really great and interesting.
Let me move on to the second question and ask you to think about what drew you to the Nashville occupation in particular. You want to start, Sarah?
Sure. Can I have that microphone? Get into it. So last year, I'm 36 this year, so last year I was 35. And it was the first time in my life I had ever seen, I'm from Nashville. It was the first time in my life I'd ever seen so many people out on the street, and I couldn't not go. It was just, I was teaching 2 classes at Vanderbilt. One was at Riverbend Maximum Security Prison, and one was about literature about workers' rights. And I think the experience of seeing it in my hometown, on the streets of my hometown, people gathering together, I think to really think about who has power in democracy, and what that looks like when we stand together, and when we start to think about ways to describe it, right? So one of the things that I kept hearing on NPR, even, you think NPR can describe any political situation, but the way that NPR was describing it, they didn't have the words to describe what was happening on the streets, and really seeing, even thinking about the architecture of this room, it strikes me as so different from the way the Occupy movement sort of set itself up. But the vocabulary and the architecture and the things that we have access to, we're seeing them live for the first time in my 35 years.
For me, it was just, I was like, oh, holy crap, it's here. I remember talking to some people like, well, who's out there? Do you know what they're doing? What's going on? We heard about the first march. I missed it. I was out of town. And then after a while, I was kind of debating about it. And I was like, oh, come on, why am I kidding myself? I'm a career activist. There's no way I cannot be there. It's here. It's in my backyard. It's down the street. So I showed up.
So my next question is, what kept you engaged with the Occupy Wall Street movement, or what made you rethink your involvement with the occupation?
I was involved in Occupy from the first day until March, April, for quite a while, and still connect with a lot of the folks there. There was something magical about what was happening on that plaza, especially early on, especially in October, November, December, January. The people that were coming together were some of the most brilliant, beautiful, thoughtful, caring people I've ever met in my life. And they were engaged, and they didn't want to lead or impose or be the main go-to person on anything. They wanted to make sure everyone's voices got heard on every matter, and we were learning about consensus and how to make decisions in a horizontal fashion. And there was something beautiful happening there. People from all different political spectrums and identities came. People from all different religious groups came. It was an incredibly diverse group early on, and something was happening there that I haven't experienced anything like ever before. It was beautiful in a lot of ways. And that's what kept me there so long. And another important thing for me was that I work on the streets with people who are unhoused, and they were all there too, and they had a voice in the process. Our unhoused neighbors were at marches, they were participating in our GAs, they were participating in the camp. We had a medical tent, we had a kitchen tent, a pantry, we had a legal team. It was beautiful. We were creating our own world where profit and capital didn't rule. And we were doing something different with public space, and it was beautiful. I'm talking about why I stayed involved in Nashville.
What kept me engaged was there was a core group of us that were really committed to the facilitation of the work, which was I think, we would begin every General Assembly and say, hey, the deal is we'll give up our opinions and our voice if you agree to this process. And so it was a hard thing to do, but it was a pretty powerful thing to do, is to say, nobody's going to hear what I think, but we'll try to help as much as possible this meeting run smoothly. It sometimes went really well. And I think the second part of the question is what I'm most interested in, which is where did you shift, or what changed your involvement? And the three of us got to sit down and talk before this, and it was the four of us. And it was, I think in some ways, as we all tried to sort of piece together what we took from it and what we're doing, because I think the general consensus is none of us think it's over, it's shifted and it's rooted and it's gone in different places. I've, for one, the experience of doing direct action organizing with a group of really smart and thoughtful people from all different walks of life really crystallized for me the desire to be a part of poor people's movement and to have things led and to do organizing in a way that I think the distinction between activism and organizing, for me in some ways, Occupy we all struggled with this, and we all had really rich conversations. I think, like Dana said, some of the best political conversations of my life happened out there. So this was something that everybody was really thoughtful of and trying to figure out, like, what does it mean to have this movement and think about people of color, to think about poor people, to think about all this stuff and our roles in it. And so I think as we all sort of shifted, they stayed much later than I did. I think we all shifted in some ways to do organizing, to do the work, and to support poor people's movements on the ground. So things like housing rights, worker-led movements.
What kept me engaged was the radically different way that we engaged one another. I'd been doing different types of community organizing and activism for about 4 or 5 years prior to when Occupy happened. And so it took a while, as it did for just about everybody, to kind of get your head wrapped around how things did happen, because the process for a General Assembly, the consensus reaching process, the working groups, all of that was so radically different from the way that I've interacted with groups of people in so many different places, whether it be in church through ministries, whether it be in school through academic groups, whether it be through clubs and different organizing groups. It was completely different. But when the dust all finally settled and I realized that here you had a space where absolutely anybody could come and be heard, and people were willing to listen, not obligated by whatever the individual status or role or class or race or body was at all, but people actually were willing to listen, and people were willing to engage, and we challenged one another to engage each other honestly and openly. And that was all incorporated into the structure of how we communicated and how we communicated ideas. Even people who didn't agree with us at all were given space, and we respected that space, and we were intentional about that. Also, the way that we made change, the way that we organized ourselves with the working groups, that was so wonderful for me to show up and to become part of a group that had a mission, that had a goal, said, okay, we're the outreach group. We're going to come together, come up with different ideas for how we can reach out to different groups and individuals in Nashville who we think might be interested in Occupy, but for whatever reason aren't here yet. But the very idea that every single person had a responsibility for making a difference, which meant that if I didn't show up one day, the work would continue. Things didn't collapse just because my individual personality wasn't there. But if I did show up, then I had an opportunity to contribute. I had an opportunity to make things happen. I had an opportunity to help, to influence, and to make a change. But also that I stayed on level footing with everyone else as well. That obligated a certain level of respect and of openness and inclusivity that was really, really different and incredibly important for me, not only just to be a part of, but also to carry to other places too.
This is a question about what key moments, not just in the Nashville Occupation, but in the movement more generally, that you think offer important lessons for how we think about the democratic political process and about the fall election season right now. And I think I'm tossing to Lindsay first on that one.
Well, I think a political moment, I was going to see if Sarah wanted to talk briefly about the college Republicans, because I want to mention one more to follow up on that.
Well, and I'm going to ask about the Nashville Occupation in particular in my next question. So, but we had thought about the nonpartisan aspect.
I was going to, this will play off another question too. But this isn't a particular moment, but this, the fact that the Occupation and Occupy Wall Street movement have remained nonpartisan has manifested itself into many moments, which we hopefully will talk about. But I haven't seen a lot of groups that are so politically charged and engaged really stand on that nonpartisan ground and really say, there's a really important space here that not a lot of people are occupying. And that's the space in between our two-party system. The two candidates that we'll be voting for in the fall, I've heard some people say, oh, they're the same, they're all owned by corporate media. I know that they're different. I feel it in my soul that they're different, and I think we can all point out those differences. But Occupy, there's a group called Occupy the Debates right now. That they have some great little videos on their websites if you're interested in that. But one of the things they're saying is, yeah, the candidates are the same, and yeah, they're different, but they're actually not going to talk about a lot of the issues that are really important to us because they feel the same about it. They feel very similarly about militarization and war. They feel very similarly about not ending corporate personhood and the corporatization of politics and of our whole sphere of life, whether it's healthcare or food. They're not going to talk about drones. They're not going to talk about the corporate control of media. They're not going to talk about the National Defense Authorization Act that was passed by Obama this past year that limits our liberties and our freedoms and can indefinitely detain American citizens without trial. They're not going to be talking about those things or about the tax evasion by corporations. And so I think Occupy is filling this really important space, and that nonpartisanship has had a lot of beautiful moments. But I think that's really important. But Occupy the Debates is a really interesting site, so I hope you'll check it out. They really are wanting to bring more topics into the debates other than just reproductive rights and a lot of the things that we hear about over and over again. It's kind of that those are the social issues to distract us from these things.
So maybe we could just narrow that down then and ask you all to think about particular moments in the Nashville occupation that offered some important insights for you.
Oh, sure. We were actually talking about this just before we got started. There was a moment sometime a little bit after we were all arrested in about probably like late October, November, where the Vanderbilt Young Republican student group came to pay a visit to Occupy Nashville with the intention of being a counter-protest to us. And so we'd heard that they were coming. There was a good bit of press about it. And we were excited about it because we thought it would be a good opportunity to engage with the students. Also, to be honest, we thought it was going to be some sort of look cute. The Occupy movement in general, and Occupy Nashville in particular, has a tradition of making sure that whenever we do come together to make a statement, that we always make sure that it's fun and enjoyable, but also that we pay close attention to the human element of things. And so when the students came, they assembled around the corner and they came marching around the plaza with signs and chanting. And we were having our General Assembly, and of course their intention was to disrupt our General Assembly. So we continued with our General Assembly was our plan. And they continued to be disruptive. And Sarah was actually our lead facilitator for that evening. And so we stopped and we gave them opportunity. We were like, you can come and join us. We'll give you a space to come and be heard. And you could see them freeze and see them kind of get confused for a little bit because they weren't expecting that. They were expecting a counter-protest. They were expecting to be yelling at people who were going to be yelling back at them, not to have a group of people who were welcoming them and wanting to hear their voices. Mm-hmm. So they continued to chant and to protest, and at one point they had several different chants they had picked out. And one of their chants was that we are the debt generation. I guess because they had an assumption that we were trying to lobby for excessive amounts of taxing that would give the future generations, people my age who are also in college, more debt. And so those of us who were in the crowd in the General Assembly were like, yeah, we're the debt generation too. So we started chanting along with them, we are the debt generation. And they just melted. They didn't know what to do. They were completely confused. And so some of us left the General Assembly and we just went over and talked to them one-on-one and just engaged them. But then, of course, you can't chant at an individual who's standing in front of you trying to have a conversation with you. And so that's what happened. Conversations began to happen. And their leader came forward. Sarah invited them to speak. They said a couple of things that those in particular of us who have been arrested found really offensive. And so several of us laughed out loud at what this young man was saying. And I can distinctly remember Sarah bellowing at all of us to be quiet and to respect the process, and that this was a person who was trying to speak, and that it didn't matter if we didn't agree with what they said. They were speaking, and we were obligated to listen. That was one of the most powerful moments I've ever experienced. That, for me, was what I've always believed nonviolence really truly is about. It's not about not hitting. It is about recognizing that people are individuals who have hurts and have concerns and that they need to be heard. And that the real way to make a difference is to engage with people on that common ground. That our partisan differences are not nearly as big as the much general frustrations that we all have, and that's where we need to come together.
And those conversations, I think, were just so powerful that they happened, and it was so wild. Every day you would see just the wildest intersections of people. And I remember one day there was a wedding of all like American flags, and everybody was dressed in red, white, and blue cowboy boots and hats. That was on the plaza, and watching that interaction between people, like adopting and exchanging and sharing the way that what the symbol meant to them, and having those conversations between each other was just so powerful, right? So people who were living on the streets out of necessity, and those are the people who are deciding to occupy out of a political conviction or in solidarity. And just like the night with the Republicans, where I think everybody's goal was to create a space for those conversations to happen, I think just generally Occupy itself, by living outside in public. We just don't have very many public spaces, and so the feeling of being able to go downtown, and I started having my office hours there, and just for my students to be able to come down and see, and the conversations that they would have with other people were so rich. This week after the Republicans came, there was I don't remember the order of this. I think there was the arrests Thursday night, Wednesday night and Thursday night, and then Friday there was the threat of the arrest. At the same time, there was a $400 a ticket dinner on the plaza. Right. So there was just this, every conversation on the plaza that night was just electric. I mean, people were really talking across lines where generally if you disagree, you don't talk to people. And so there's these people who were having these conversations. And I think if I could, because these juxtapositions were just one of the most powerful thing to me. I only slept out, they occupied a lot. I only slept out one night, and I went to sleep, and there was a cello playing in, there's the Legislative Plaza, and then there's the War Memorial. And somebody had gone inside the War Memorial with a cello, and at 2 in the morning it started, because it was hard to fall asleep, there's traffic noise, and there's all this stuff. And they started playing the cello, and we all, I didn't count, I think hundreds of people that night. It was one of the biggest nights that people were occupying, and everybody fell asleep to this cello music. And then somewhere a few hours later, because I don't want to romanticize, it was hard and ugly and messy and terrible at times too. We woke up in the middle of the night, and there was a young kid whose parents were homeless, and he was waking up because it was freezing outside, and they were outside because they had to be, and a woman next to them had a seizure, and an ambulance was called. And I think that for me, those moments, I'm reminded, one of my favorite guys who talks about the Occupy movement said, nobody is doing anything at Occupy, and I agree to a large extent of his analysis of it. Nobody's doing anything at Occupy. What happens is, there's the roadrunner in the cartoons who's running, and he runs off the cliff, ignoring the fact that the cliff has, the earth has stopped and there's now only air below him. And he's ignoring that, and so he doesn't fall. And then all of a sudden he looks down and he sees that there's nothing below him, and he plummets to his, well, he doesn't die because he's the roadrunner, but he plummets. And I think that what Occupy did for me is just to say, look, there's nothing under you, right? Like, there's nothing holding us up right now. That really making that visible and being able to see that it's not the people out on the plaza who were dreaming. They were not the dreamers. In some ways, it's the people who were imagining that they weren't falling were the dreamers.
Yeah. We're going to have time for Q&A at the end. And so let me just ask a couple more questions. And I just wanted to add quickly, a week after the Vanderbilt Republicans came to the occupation, and it's also a matter of press record. It's not subjective impressions of what happened. There were reporters there that covered the extraordinary conversation that erupted by the end of the evening, and the rapprochement that the different people had found on the plaza, and the genuine excitement of the Republicans at being involved in those conversations. But I went to an event at Vanderbilt the following week as a speaker, and many of those college Republicans were there, and they had a completely different account of the event, where they had gone and shouted and triumphed and cowed the occupiers and had defeated their political naivete. And I was just incredulous, because that wasn't what I had witnessed. I knew that was not what had happened, but it did make me realize the extent to which our own political self-enclaving reinforces our ability to literally misremember history, to tell ourselves different and not true stories that reinforce our own political self-righteousness. And I don't think that's something that's limited to Republicans. I think it crosses, the proverbial aisle. And it made me realize how incredibly precious that public space is, where people come together and talk across those differences, because that conversation builds muscles for a different kind of memory. So if all we have is that retreat back into the enclave, of course we're going to misremember and repolarize. What's so precious about the occupation was the opening of that incredibly different space. So let me ask another couple of questions, and this one I think leads in a nice way. Lots of commentators and people on the street think the Occupy movement was a failure. How would you respond to that?
I'll take a shot at that. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I think just a couple months after Occupy Wall Street started, the media was very quick to dismiss it and very quick to deviantize it and say that it was dead. We had just come, if you think about where we had come from, we had just come from the Arab Spring. I was glued to my computer watching people fill Tahrir Square, and within a matter of weeks, all across the Middle East, dictators were toppling within a matter of weeks. It was fast, things were moving, it was incredible. We have a very short historical memory span in the United States. I believe a lot of us do. And we didn't think about the decades of struggle and oppression and movement building that happened to bring those points to a peak. I was reading recently that the women's suffrage movement took 72 years before women were able to vote. The abolitionists, it took them over 30 years trying to abolish slavery. Change doesn't happen overnight. We've seen a one-year kind of glimpse of something that's moving and shaping and happening. And if you're familiar with the church calendar, we have different seasons, and ordinary time is the biggest part of the church calendar. Then you have Advent and Christmas and Easter and Lent, but the biggest part of the church calendar is ordinary time. I think that we're in Occupy or movement ordinary time right now, where we're building, we're stepping back, we're getting together, we're talking and meeting. And I think that something's still happening, whether it's going to be called Occupy or not. One of the best things about Occupy is that it created a space for us to come together and look at each other in the eyes, look at each other face to face. Occupy Nashville was never about occupying the city of Nashville. That was never its goal, and people may still think that's what its goal was. That's never the point. The point was to occupy the consciousness and the imagination of a generation, and to get us to realize that if we come together, another world is possible, where profit doesn't drive everything, where capital doesn't drive everything. There's still a lot of networks of people who met through Occupy and are now working on housing. We're now working on food justice, environmental stuff, workers' rights. And now we're more connected than we've ever been. And that's really exciting. I could go on and on about a lot of the successes that I saw amongst the failures, but I do want to try to frame it in a different way. Whether the next manifestation of the energy that's happening is called Occupy or not, something is still happening and people are awake. Occupy is like, I heard it compared to a fire alarm that goes off when the house is burning down, right? And it tells the people, wake up, there's a freaking fire in here, like get the hell out. Occupy may not be the firefighters that come to save the house. It may not be the neighbors that call 911, but it's waking people up, and that's what I'm excited about.
I echo everything that Lindsay said 100%, and she and I and Sarah and so many others have had conversations about this very thing for a long time. As a student of the civil rights movement, it was one of my greatest frustrations when I first became an activist myself with how many people, in particular on college campuses, because that's where I started doing most of my organizing, would really and truly believe that you can make a difference with a serious nationwide issue in the matter of a couple of days or weeks. And I would get so frustrated when people would just peter off because they just didn't see things going anywhere. I didn't feel like things were happening. I didn't feel like people cared. Movements take years, they take decades, they take generations and lifetimes. There are so many people who gave up their lives to make a difference in the worlds that they inhabited, knowing that they would not see the change that they were working for. And that was the point. That was the point. And that was one of the things that attracted me to Occupy as well, because it was bizarre, right? One of the early slogans was Occupy everything and demand nothing. It made no sense to me at all. And yet it did make sense, because the point was to give people a space to be heard and to recognize that they needed to be heard and to recognize that they needed to speak up. That alone was an issue. I said from an early part of my organizing was that I really didn't have much of an issue that I worked on primarily beyond getting people engaged in their communities and waking people up. Sometimes it's not even a matter of waking people up. Sometimes when people have been oppressed for so very, very long, they are either so, it's not that they're lazy, it's not that they're accustomed to their situation, but it's because misery and discouragement has become a part of their reality. And it takes something really radical to really brighten up the idea that just maybe you can do something about it. And just maybe you have a right to be heard. And even people will tell you that you don't have a right to be heard. And that much more requires you to stand up for that right and to take that space if you have to. For me, that was what Occupy was so important for. And for me, that's why it can't fail. What we did was not for us. What we did, going to jail, all those things, people asked a lot, well, why did you go to jail? You were in the middle of school, you had papers to write. It's like, because it wasn't for me. It wasn't for the politicians or the troopers who asked to put me in jail. It was for whoever many people actually saw me on TV and for who it made a difference for.
I think in the tradition of the occupation, rather than continuing to ask questions, there are so many interested and interesting people in the audience. I'd really love to use the rest of the time to hear and develop a little dialogue with you all. So let's get that going. There's a gentleman in the back here.
We do have some microphones so that you can be heard better, unless everyone just wants to repeat his question.
Here comes the microphone. We could human mic it. It's fun. It takes time, though.
I'd like to thank each of you for what has been said. To some, it is truly frightening, the polarization between the two parties in this country and some of the rhetoric that points alarmingly towards another civil war when our first civil war was the greatest tragedy and travesty in the history of this particular country, as most civil wars are anywhere. I find it truly frightening that this rhetoric is allowed to go on, and that's why I personally have not become involved in anything. The polarization between the two parties has become so extreme, in my meager opinion, that there won't be any reconciliation on a political level at this point in time. Now, hopefully, the Beatles changed the world, the Dalai Lama changed the world. Hopefully, over time, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley and those that came after her changed the world. Dr. Martin Luther King changed the world. Oprah Winfrey is changing the world. Bill Gates, many examples, more than I can think of. But to some of us, it's truly frightening, the polarization, and thank you for your time.
Well, if I could just quickly respond. I mean, I think that that's one of the great things about being out and, again, having those conversations with people from wildly different political persuasions, like DJ said, and finding common ground. That was one of the most powerful pieces, is just being out there and hearing something beyond the media depiction of how far apart we are, and really seeing what we had in common. It was pretty cool.
One of the saddest fallouts for me in terms of the media misrepresentations of all of the occupations really had to do with the way people who didn't take the time to go to any of the occupations misunderstood the occupations as some kind of left radical fringe group of pot-smoking hippies or hippie wannabes or whatever their labels were. And that's what I kept saying, and it's what I was saying in my blogs too. When people would characterize the occupations that way, I would just shake my head at them and say, have you been? Because on the ground, what was extraordinary were really all of the different kinds of people who were turning up and making conversation across genuine political difference. There were libertarians at the occupation, there were anarchists at the occupation, and also part of the fun was realizing it's not really a two-party system representing political difference in the United States. There's such a broad range of political opinion, and really intelligent political opinion. And so the fun of being down there was just this amazing education in what my neighbors actually think and how poorly that's represented by our really divisive two-party system. More?
My name is Barbara Woods Washington, and I pastored a church in New York City in the 80s. And last year in September, one of my members called me and said, turn on the TV, turn on the TV. See what's going on down on Wall Street, turn on the TV. And I took my clicker and I clicked and I clicked and I clicked and I clicked. So I had to go to the internet to find out what all this was that was going on Wall Street. And the next morning I turned on the TV again and I clicked and I clicked and I clicked. And at that point, and I write a column for the Nashville Pride, it's a weekly column, but I have an email list of over 250 people that I have been sending my column to in churches that I have pastored. I pastored a church in Atlanta, and I'm a former chaplain at Bennett College. But I sent an email out to them saying that I'm no longer in New York, but I made a personal commitment this morning to be a part of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And I did it by researching on a daily basis, and I put together a single page, and I sent it out to all these folks. And I kept telling them, let me know when you see something on TV where you live. Nobody ever saw anything on television. Now, just last week, or well, it's last month now, at the 100th anniversary, one of the photos that I pulled off the internet was at the anniversary when the police had 2 people down on the ground. And when I emailed that out, I told them, I said, no, this is not Birmingham, and no, this is not the 60s. So that the thing that is most important to me about the Occupy movement, and I haven't been on the site of any one of them, but nonstop for a year, I have completely researched every level of everything that I've seen. It's the intellect of this movement that just blows me away.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have kind of a comment, and I'm kind of curious of I've talked to several people that Occupy movement. I work for the state, and I've gone over the Legislative Plaza when it was there. And I come from a background that's a little bit different. My grandparents came from Russia. They were happy to be here. And it seems like the Occupy movement, the people I talked to there, is anybody that's rich got there by stealing it from somebody else. My grandparents came over with the idea that with what they had, that they could create wealth in America where they didn't have that opportunity where they were. They were happy to be here. They were happy to vote Democratic, by the way, because that's what democratic and democracy, that all kind of merged together, those two words. In the 30s sometime, the president of the Democratic Party, he warned the Democrats when he stepped down that their platform has changed so much that if you took the word Democrat and took the word communist out of the two platforms, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. I see a difference now, in just since Reagan years. I see where now it's like America, it's like everybody thinks, not everybody, but the occupiers that I met, they seem to think that this was all stolen. You know, all wealth is stolen from somebody else, and that the poor people are the ones that paid for it. That's not true. The occupiers, I've gone and talked to them. Many of them that I talked to 3 directly, and I observed some, but a lot of them were selling contributors on the weekends or during the week. You know, they're asking me for money to support them, and then they're over there and they're just belligerent. I talked to one woman that was there, and she was, she got irate very quickly. I was asking, well, why is she there? Don't you think this? And she got mad, she was upset. I wasn't very impressed with the Occupy Wall Street, and also they compared themselves with the Tea Party. Now, I was curious here, how many people in this room would, if you look at 4 parties like Democrats, Republicans, Tea Party, Occupiers, how many people would label themselves in each one? I don't understand the occupiers. I don't understand the background. It seems like they're people of irresponsibility, and the reason why I say that is the ones I talked to were not working, or they divorced their wives or husbands, they weren't married to anybody, they didn't have children, or if they did have children, they weren't taking care of them. These are all the factors I'm seeing. And one other thing I'll mention is you wouldn't let somebody move into your house and make decisions about your house and what you're going to spend money for in the house unless they contributed. You're not going to invite somebody in. Originally, to be a voter in America, you were supposed to be a landowner or a property owner of some sort. That makes sense. That makes sense to me. Why would you let somebody move into your house, has no responsibility, fiscal responsibility or otherwise, and then you say, well, you can have a say-so in how we're going to take care of this house? I wouldn't do it. And who would go to work for anybody unless they had some monetary reward for it? There's some benefit they get. Look at me. I came to this meeting not because I wanted to hear this, but because I got a free ham sandwich, you know? So we all benefit somehow by this. I don't understand Occupy. I wish I did. I didn't understand Tea Party. I wanted to, and when I asked questions, it made a lot more sense.
What is your specific question to the panel?
I'm sorry. I get soapboxed.
We're on limited minutes, and I want the conversation to develop. So.
Well,
could I respond quickly?
Yes.
I would like to explain a little bit about, I think your concern about the economic and social status and lifestyle, some of the people who you met and talked to, and in particular too about what I've come to see as an assumption about a lot of people who join the Occupy movement or who express concerns about economic injustice. I'll preface that by saying that there's something called privilege. Privilege is something that is socially and politically and culturally handed to some people and not to others. So, for instance, your reference to the landowners rule early on about how people could vote, there's also a rule that certain people were considered to be only 3/5 human, people who, like me, have an ancestry of African heritage. Why that was done is because that there was an expectation that if a person had a certain body, then therefore they were given certain rights. And so people who were able to have land, people who had access to wealth, who had access to political power, more often than not were people who were considered more culturally and socially significant than others. As a result, that tended to leave a lot of people, usually the majority of people, in the lurch, so to speak, politically and economically. That's not a matter of choice. Most people who are poor do not choose to be poor. And the reality of poverty is that it is not something that, for most people, can be changed with just a couple of years of work.
If that's true, within my grandparents, if they were born in that situation, how in the world do you justify that they could make it on their own, come to America and do all this?
I really appreciate your point. I think it's a really fair one. Certainly some people have successfully worked their way up from extraordinary poverty, so I don't think anybody's attacking your grandparents, even though I understand you feel you didn't have a successful dialogue on the plaza. I would really like to get a bunch of different perspectives into the few minutes that we have left.
You're done with the opposing.
No, sir.
One other thing. Dr. Woods, this is a federal republic, not a democracy. And everybody should know that.
Yes, sir, I write about that in my book. Can we get some other points of view
Well,
in here? And I'd love it if you would stay and listen to the responses, sir. Sarah? Okay.
Well, as he leaves, I'll say that he makes the most important.
Thank you.
He makes the most important point about organizing ever is that sandwiches are really the key to bringing people together. It is very true, and I agree wholeheartedly with that.
Anybody in the audience who were, yeah.
I think you made a very compelling case for the enjoyment of bringing diverse views together, possibly creating a movement out of it. In some ways, the United States was done that way, brought together and followed a path of nationhood towards the worship of money. You could say that. Some religions have brought together multiple religions and created very powerful unified religions. I think of Islam as one. And somebody at lunch today said to me, I was talking about trying to come to the unity of the spirit, and the statement was that perhaps you can only understand that when you're alive. When you're dead and you're unified, you're part of it. And my question is, once you've become unified, will you still enjoy it as much? Because then you'll be the one that's leading. It's even in the mix of races. When you have a different race, you can see that they're mixed, and then people become stronger, better genetics. But once everybody has the same genes and is unified, there's a lack of diversity to unify. Mm-hmm. I don't know if my question's appropriate or not, but.
There's a really short, I love the slogan, one no and many yeses. In some ways, that's what it felt like Occupy was. And it feels, I think we haven't spent enough time talking about the deep discomfort that all of us feel in any way acting like we're representing anything, right? I mean, every single person on, I'm so glad people are here and there can be conversation afterwards. Every single person had very, very different views and ideas, and I think that that's one of the great things about one no and many yeses is it still is something you can build you can build a critique around. That's what it is it's a critique, and then the ways that people work on that together. All of us work really differently. And on different issues and different things, but we can call on each other as allies and to work in solidarity across campaigns and projects that we're working on.
One final question? Great, thanks.
Mine's not a question. I had a comment and also a couple of pieces of information I think might interest people. My comment, I attended a few of the General Assembly sessions of Occupy, not as many as the people on the panel, but I did attend some, and I saw something there that I wish more people had seen. I saw how participatory democracy works. It's a difficult process. It's where you're trying to get everyone to agree to everything. It's consensus democracy, and it takes a lot of conversation and a lot of politeness, and it's a very tedious process. But I think my belief is that it would get easier if people stay together longer, because once people get to know each other better and get to understand better each other's viewpoints and each other's hopes and dreams and goals and all that, I think. And once they care about one another more, I think it would be easier for them to reach agreements. The two pieces of information. This morning I saw an article about a book that it's very relevant. There's a book by a guy named Carney Ross. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his first name right. He's written a book called The Leaderless Revolution. And it's, to some extent, he's describing what the Occupy consensus democracy process was like, even though he started writing the book a couple of years before the Occupy movement began. And he used to be fairly high up in the British government, but he resigned from it because he didn't like the way that things were going. He came to a conclusion, I'm not sure if I'm stating his conclusion correctly or misrepresenting it slightly, but I think that what he decided is that representative democracy isn't working, and we have to go to participatory democracy, that's the only thing that we have a hope of making a go with. And so he has a website, it's theleaderlessrevolution.com, and it has a short article by him that I thought was very good. It said very clearly, more clearly than I could, some of this stuff about participatory democracy, and it's also got a couple of videos of him being interviewed. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was that tonight, a lot of you are going to be watching this presidential candidates debate, and I wanted to mention there's an alternate version of it being broadcast on Democracy Now! Tonight, and that version will take twice as long, and the reason is because what they're going to do on Democracy Now! Is after Obama and Romney have their say on each question, the moderator is going to pause the tape and then ask the same questions of Jill Stein and Rocky Anderson, the candidates from the Green Party, and which party is Rocky Anderson in? I don't know. It's one of the other lesser parties. And so, since you've got twice as many candidates in that version, the whole thing's going to take twice as long. But you will hear, instead of hearing one viewpoint stated twice, you will hear three different viewpoints. You'll hear one viewpoint stated twice, and then two more viewpoints. And so Democracy Now! You can find it on the web. Just Google Democracy Now!
We are going to have to wrap it up. I'd like to just tell you what's going to happen before I thank our panelists today. Next month, we have, on the day after the election, we have a session on visions of the future with my colleague Michael Bess, who's a historian of the future, another colleague, Mike Vandenberg, who's a really good environmental lawyer, and Samar Ali, who works for the government here as a director of overseas economic development, something like that. And I think you've got to come back. And they're not going to be talking about the election, but they'll be talking about things that the election has relevance to. But today I'd like to just thank enormously Sarah and DJ and Lindsay and Dana. I really have learned a lot. The only question I didn't get the chance to ask is, I remember in 1968 going to demonstrations in London, and we gave flowers to policemen, called it Flower Power, and that broke, it was a step beyond talking to the Republicans. We actually compromised the powers that be, and it changed the relationship between these crowds and the people that were policing them. Kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.